Welcome back to the Right Cast. This is the fourth episode. We're doing something a little different. So I guess by the time you see this, you will see the length of the video and you'll think this is not 2 hours or 1 hour's 40 minutes. What is going on? Well, basically, we're doing something where we're just trying to put out more episodes more consistently and have it where we can, because in terms of scheduling, mostly on my end, it's just a thing where sometimes it's a bit difficult to just get it done weekly. I'm just being transparent because that's my style, but honestly, it's not of much concern. The topic is way more interesting, and it's gonna be something we're gonna talk about. Also, just as a side note, if you see us like wearing the same clothes or something in multiple episodes, this is why. It's not because we're not changing clothes week in week out. Okay, it's just because we might be recording some of these back to back, all right, and then releasing them over the weeks. Just so you know, because I know people on the internet, you can be a bit, a bit judgmental. You might see the thumbnails and think, oh, these guys are writers. They don't shower or whatever. I don't know. Anyway,
I have met those writers that are like, "Hey, I can get away with wearing the same outfit 3 or 4 days in a row."
it happens. Apparently, people say, oh, well, the reason, what is it? They say like, oh, the smartest people, they spend so much of their mental energy focusing on other things that they think very little about what to dress and keep it simple, which I guess can make some sense. I guess that's true. It's not true for me. But then maybe I'm just not very smart. I don't know. But anyway, so the topic today is to do with how much preparation should you put into a story, basically. And to a greater or lesser extent, somewhat to, kind of understanding maybe how much time goes into a story before you will feel comfortable with thinking it is good enough. So before you think I'm done, or this is something that's solid, or this is something to put out into the world, because I think that's also another thing that's very important and kind of comes at the other side of it, which is okay, before you start, there might be a lot of prep, there might be a lot of things you think about, or there may not be. But then when you're finished, you might also then start thinking a lot about, oh, how long should I take before I submit this to publishers or before I self-publish it, or how much edits does it need, how much revisions does it need. So this is going to be an episode where we just kind of talk about our experience with that and what I guess we think is generally what we found to work best with that. So Anthony, if you'd like to start, because this is something you had more questions with than me.
Yeah, so both of us are writers, and we're both very familiar that there are very different types of writers out there. Generally, when you hear from novelists, they talk about they're either one of two things. They're either a pantser or a plotter. They're either a gardener or adventurer. They're either the type where they love to start off with this very long and lengthy plan in terms of how they're going to approach their novel, or the type that they're going to be very bare bones and then just kind of write and go along with what I feel. Just kind of come up with it on the fly, and that's how they develop their story. So for you, with your novel, where did you fall in those two categories?
Which do you think?
I'm going to guess that you had a very, very detailed plan.
Okay, well that's good. At least it doesn't look like I was pantsing it. I don't know if that would be better or worse. But yeah, it was very, very, very detailed. Very, very detailed. Yeah, very detailed, because I was planning out, I was trying to understand where I wanted the story to go from the beginning to the end. So an entire saga or series trilogy, rather than just, oh, book one. Because I already knew, like, no, I want this to be an actual series and I want this to have a story that spans. I mean, if you read the very beginning of the story, it makes it pretty clear in the prologue, in a sort of meta sense, that this is at the very least going to have three parts to it. So there's no way that this is going to be like, oh, you just read book one, that's all of it. Um, Obviously, you still want the first book to have enough of its own story, but it's, yeah. So I definitely planned out quite extensively. I had a lot of outlines, so many Word documents. I've still got pretty much all of them. And yeah, there's so much cringe ideas. Bear in mind, I started, uh, wow, it was almost, what is it? It's 2023 now. So not too far, almost about 10 years ago. And so, like, yeah, you can imagine some of my ideas back then was a bit like, okay, what is this? It's a bit cringe, but yeah, very extensive. I'm definitely, and the thing is, just with any story in general, by the way, when I make it, I always outline. I don't feel comfortable starting a story if I do not have an outline. If I, even if it's a short story, I just feel like I have to plot something out. I have attempted to just write things, and I can write things just straight off the top of my head, but I just find I care so much more about having that impact at different points and pinpointing. And I like knowing where it is and where it's coming. It makes me more excited about writing it, knowing, yeah, when we get to this part, it's going to be this. And it just helps me feel more comfortable with the structure. It's funny, I've never heard the term adventurer before, though. I'd always heard I think it's gardeners and architects. And I like the word architect, so that always made me feel better about like, yes, I'm an architect, like
That's
anyway.
actually my first time. I've never heard the architect term before.
I don't know. That's always the one I heard. That is very interesting. I've never heard adventurer. So, but yeah.
Yeah, that must be maybe like a Western thing where it's like, oh, we have to make the Western authors more cool, so we're gonna go with adventurer.
Mm. But
So,
yeah.
uh, so along those notes, both of us are in the same boat. We both are very much planners where we like to come up with our detailed outlines, everything we want to accomplish with our novels. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective. What are the kind of key things you like to plan out? And then maybe a few things that you don't necessarily plan out. What do you feel is essential before you can write? And what do you feel you can, even though you're a planner, leave out and figure out as you go along?
So plot, uh, characters, and to a greater or lesser extent, the setting. To be honest, really everything. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of things that I kind of let flow. Characters is an interesting one because I can't recall because it's been a while ago now, but I'm pretty sure one thing that I was learning when I was first beginning was that with characters, obviously you want them to feel organic and natural. So you shouldn't like if you write an outline, you don't need to necessarily outline the character as well, just so that that way it's like not necessarily like you don't have to outline exactly what the character is doing in the same type of way as you would the plot, because then I guess you don't want the character to feel robotic or feel like they're following a certain line. I don't know what happened, but somewhere along the line that just I didn't find that mattered to me. So I just outlined the character regardless, and I not found personally in my mind to have that being issue. And I think maybe that's because the characters, since it's such character driven stories that I'm usually telling, knowing what the character is doing is an essential part of the plot. So it's more the character is the focus, and the plot is more kind of like what said is more kind of what's the way to describe it? It's like the driving. It's like the thing that drives the character to do certain things. But at the end of the day, the character is what I think is going to have the most impact on you. So for me, it's important to know where the character starts and where they're going, so that I can better shape the plot. Basically, you have that common issue where people say, "I feel like that the characters exist just to move the plot forward." I definitely am more of the mentality of the plot exists to serve the characters rather than the characters exist to serve the plot. So I, whilst there are certain things conceptually I would like to see, I've noticed mostly it's character based things like, oh, this character trope or this type of character archetype. What would it be like if you did this with it rather than this magic system archetype or this storytelling archetype? I do have some of that, but I've noticed that is not as much of where my focus is as much as the character side. So characters for me, definitely I need to know who's in the story, what's their motivation, what's their personality, where are they going, why are they here. If I'm gonna pick who the POV characters are, like who is it? For example, in my very first book, there was mostly just it was only really two POVs, but there are a couple others, and I mean there's three in a sense if you count the interludes and stuff. And so all of those three were picked deliberately. And then it's like then at one point in the story, it's like there's another POV, and that POV only lasts for a chapter, and it's like that was done on purpose. So all of those types of things I've planned out. I don't really. There are times where things might happen randomly, but even if it does, it won't be too random because it will just be more like as I'm going through the structure, I notice an opportunity, like, oh, this would be a good point to add this in. But for the most part, there's a structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And so I'm also curious to hear where you mentioned that in your book you do have multiple POVs. So
Mhm.
I'm curious with your development. For me, when I outline the story, the plot is usually the very last thing that I plan out. I usually
Mhm.
figure out the characters, figure out the setting, figure out the major twists, and then figure out the rest of the plot and how it all connects together.
Yeah.
For you, do you map it out chapter by chapter where this plot development has to happen in this chapter, this plot development has to happen in that chapter? Or do you just go with a more general outline and then just kind of cut it off into pieces as you go along?
No, it's chapter by chapter. It's very much like chapter one. I'm doing it right now. In fact, this is something I've been stuck on for a long time with the book I'm currently writing, which is the sequel, which is just having the outline. I was telling you this before in the previous episode to do with like being stuck in the middle. This is the issue. It's like I'm outlining it and I'm like, oh, I'm at this chapter, I'm at this point, and I need to make the chapters tied together. And because and I a long time ago made a I don't know why, but I made and maybe I shouldn't do this. I don't know. But I made a decision that I would force myself to go chronologically and not skip. And I remember the reason why was because ages ago, I remember listening to some writing advice somewhere that was to do with like where that exact question of like, oh, should you skip ahead? Should you do this? Should you do that? And I remember one person said, well, I don't do that because basically I'm forcing myself to they were basically trying to force themselves to have the discipline to go through just writing it. And they basically saw it as like, I should basically be able to write the story from start to finish and not necessarily feel like I have to skip. Now, I don't know if it doesn't really matter to the to the audience at the end. Like once they read it, they don't know the difference for the most part, probably, especially if you did it like well and tied it together. But I think for me, there's just something, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's some weird pride or something. I don't know. But there's something in me where I kind of just think, well, if the chapter's that bad that I can't enjoy it or I feel like and it's not even that it's bad. Sometimes it's just, I might feel like it's tough. But even then, I just kind of think, well, why is it so hard? Like I should be able to figure this out. It shouldn't be that hard for me to do. Um, and I kind of just view it as a challenge. Like basically, if there's chapters I know right now in the book I want to write, like right towards the end, there's certain chapters I really for years I've always wanted to write and I still haven't written them, and I just oh my god I want to get to them so badly, and 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 I'm at this point right now where I'm stuck and I'm like I need to get there. I could just skip ahead and write it, but that feels like so unsatisfying and cheating. I want when I get there to feel like I earn it. I think that's the major reason why and so even with outlining, I don't even feel right outlining certain things. And I will say this, because I outline in two different ways in a sense. So I have just general notes of like plot things, character stuff, like I don't know, like a character profile or almost like a plot little like plot ideas I might have. So for example, I might have an idea like this character will die. That's not really specific, but let's just say I had something like that.
Mhm.
And I will have in like a document a bunch of like bullet points and notes of just different ideas that I know somewhere I want to happen. I like and I might know this will be book 3, this will be book 2, this is another series and I want this to happen. So I will know there's certain things I at least at some point in the story want to happen, and I'll make a document of just all those ideas that I just want to happen somewhere. But when I'm actually outlining the story, like chapter by chapter, that's the whole thing I do. And I'll look at that document and say, okay, what are some of the things in there that I know need to happen in this story? And I'll just look at that and think, all right, where in this chapter outline would that make sense and would that fit? So yeah, so that's like the two ways I outline, if that makes sense. But yeah, what would you say with you is the way how you would do it? Like, is it similar, like with chapter by chapter, or just
No, it's pretty much chapter by chapter.
yeah, okay.
Um, yeah, pretty much. It's kind of funny. It would help if we had two different approaches in order to fill out this episode, but it sounds like we pretty much do almost the exact same thing. I'm even
Hmm.
struggling to think right now of maybe anything that we do differently. But yeah, I'm very much a chapter by chapter, figure out my characters, figure out my world, figure out my events, come up with the plot, and then only after I figure out everything, I'll start writing.
Hmm.
What's interesting for me, I'm interested to hear if this happened to you. So generally speaking, I tend to plan more than what I need with my outlines. I end up writing too much in my outlines, and I realized if I try to turn this into a book, it's just going to turn into this ginormous thing that's going to overwhelm people.
Hmm.
And so I usually find now that whenever I make an outline, I would say I cut about a quarter to a third of the action sequences I had planned, because those are usually pretty easy to replace, pretty easy to throw out, and they don't have a huge impact on the plot or character development. So I'm wondering if that happens to you, and what do you feel like you usually have to cut from your outlines?
Hmm. I don't think I've had to cut a lot of things. Like I've definitely had to change things around, but I don't think I can really, because I would remember that. Like I don't really feel like there's at any point where I really sat there and was like, that definitely when I've had to do rewrites and just completely change the structure of the story. But if you're talking about just in an outline where I'm outlining, I'm like, let me just remove all this stuff. I mean, when I was writing my first book, it was a lot of things I ended up removing in the end. So I guess
Mhm.
technically, yeah, sure, there was like a lot of things I cut out. There's a lot. In fact, most of the original story is completely gone. I mean, it's just a lot of the general ideas are still there, but a lot of the original first version of how I wrote my story was completely different. There was things that in later books was right up in book one, and it just made it way too weird and it was just it didn't make any sense. And it was structured terribly, and it was just about shock value, and yeah, it was terrible. But so that changed over time. So in that regard, I changed a lot of things and cut a lot of things out. But if when I had a clearer vision of what I wanted and I sat down to write the outline, I wrote the very first outline I did in like a day, and most of it didn't change that drastically over time. It was just certain things that I felt like I could flesh this out more, or over time I thought, okay, that is a bit of a weak way of presenting this character. I could present it more like this, but I don't think there was a ton of things I just thought, let me just delete all of this or let me cut this out completely. As far as I remember, anyway, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't recall really doing that a lot.
And so you just brought up the time thing, so I wanted to ask you about that next. Where for me, I again, it's the joke for this point at the podcast. I've done a whole lot of books, so I have experience doing this, but it
Mhm.
still takes me about 2 to 3 hours to go from a from scratch, nothing on the page outline to my outline is now done enough that even if it isn't 100% complete, there's enough here that I feel ready to work on a book. So, how long do you feel like it takes you to develop an outline from scratch to I'm now ready to work on a book?
Mm, outline from scratch. I can tell you the very first time I did it, it took 9 months. So I outlined for 9 months, and then after 9 months, I felt like okay, I can open Word and I can start with the chapter one or whatever. That was when
Was
I
that
made
for your whole series or just for your first book?
first book. Um, I've never outlined the whole series. Still, I've not done that. I know I what I was talking about earlier, where I said I've got like a document that has all the general like things I want to see happen. I have that, and I know there's these things I want to happen in the series. But in terms of an outline from like the beginning to the very end, like this is chapter one, book one, all the way up until chapter whatever in the last book. No, I don't have anything like that where I know beat for beat what's going to happen in the entire series. Like especially when I think about the book after this one, the third one, there's certain things that in my head are gonna happen for sure, and I know there's certain twists and certain character moments that are gonna happen for sure. But so much of that third book to me is still a mystery. I have no idea how all of that stuff's gonna actually come about, and I'm still debating it. But I trust that when I get there, it will be good and make enough sense because when I like with the first book, looking at that first version I made and how I thought, oh, this is good, and then how I changed it, I know for a fact that I trust that I will make something better. Because when I did that with my first book is like, oh gosh, I'm so glad I figured it out and made it better than it was. And to the point where now, even years later, whilst I might look at it and think, I don't like this, or this could have been done better. Overall, as the story, I'm content with it. I'm fine with it as an overall book and as a story from start to finish. Like I think that the story I set out to tell, I told it, and I feel satisfied with it. There was a time where it took me a long while to ever feel like it was done, and I always just thought I need to keep going back to fix it. There was always issues with it. And now I don't feel that way at all. And anything that I feel like that about, it's not even to do with an issue of that book. It's more of a matter of I just need to get to the sequels so that those things can be fleshed out, because I know them, but people reading them don't know. And so then sometimes people are like, oh, there's this thing, and I'm like, I can't say nothing, but yes, like, and I feel like, even though I know, I'm being honest, even if I was to say it to someone, it feels like I'm just saying that, or like I'm just, or like I've just, oh, now that they've said that, let me find a way to fix that. It's like, no, I wish they knew. I wish they knew. But yeah, I guess at least I've got those notes as proof.
Yep. And I think this is something helpful to communicate to the audience, especially if you're working on your first story.
Mhm.
Even if you do have your outline and you feel like you have the super detailed plan that you know is going to be awesome if you stick to it, leave room to change, leave room to edit and revise. Even experienced writers encounter this all the time. I know for myself, I'm working on act 5 of 7 of my zombie series right now.
Mhm.
And I'm about halfway into the story, and I just threw out a third of the outline because I realized, well, if I make some changes here, if I got rid of these battles and have this conversation go on here, have this happen to this character, it's going to make for a better story.
Yeah.
And that's a thing where a lot of people say that there are the two types of writers. It's pretty much at the point where pretty much everyone just plans and then everyone leaves room to revise as they go along. And so that's a skill that you need to master as a writer is make your plan, but be able to pivot when you realize something isn't working as well as it should.
Yeah, I actually, that's something I came to that same realization a while ago, that I've realized I think most people kind of do both. And I think it's somewhat foolish to not like switch whenever it's necessary. Because if you're just rigid about your plan, you're like, no, the plan's got to stay. It's like, well, maybe it's garbage. Like, no, maybe it needs to change. You know, like one thing I can say was a major change for me. If we're talking about actually something that disrupted my entire outline in the earlier days, was one of my POV characters, which was Parrots. When I first created her, she was meant to be the opposite of her personality that she is now. So she was meant to actually be genuinely very humble, very nice person, always just like very gracious. But I felt like that made her too similar to my other POV character, and I just thought this is kind of like, they feel too similar. There's not enough difference. Even if one's more competent than the other, I just felt like it wasn't, I didn't like it. And also in terms of where I realized in my vision where I went to take the character, it would just make it way more interesting. Um, and I thought it was more nuanced to do it where so instead I made her humbleness more of a thing she does outwardly, and then internally she's more like arrogant and thinks differently. And sometimes that comes through. So because and the exact moment that happened was with her very first chapter, because I started writing it, and there's this moment where she's loses a fight, and this is something that meant a lot to her. Now when I first wrote it, there's a moment where a character puts their hand out to her, like to say good fight or whatever, and initially she just took the hand, and it was just like, that was it. It was just like, yeah, good, good. It was all humble, great, good sportsmanship. But when I sat down to actually write, and this is the thing, my entire outline of her character was based on her accepting that hand and being a humble person. The second I actually sat down to write the character, I was like, this doesn't feel right. She would not take that hand. She would smack that hand away. She would be pissed. She like, this doesn't feel right. This does, and it's crazy because you're saying about having to pivot, and I could have just been stubborn and being like, no, let me just keep it like this. But something in me just said that does not feel right. That's a really interesting thing though, because I've heard a lot of writers say, and I do think this is very true, about how sometimes a lot of things in writing is instinctive. And because how do you teach someone to know when to feel like that? You know what I mean? And it's kind of like, and the worst part about it though is if you don't have that feeling at the right times for the right things, your story will suffer because of it. So it's actually kind of crazy to think about, because if you don't have that instinct of knowing when to do the pivoting, as you say, then your story is going to be, my story would have been a lot weaker if I did not pivot, but I had to have the instinct to know that I needed to pivot. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on like maybe if that's teachable, or where that comes from, or anything about that kind of instinct of knowing when to shift.
I think part of it is just actually having an outline in the first place, where
Mm,
once you have that outline in place, your subconscious is always thinking about it as you write. It's always thinking about, okay, I already know how it's supposed to go. Now, how can I make it better? So
mm,
I think that inner voice, that instinct to pivot, is because something probably in the back of your brain realized, well, maybe there is something here that I realize I can make better if I just do something a little bit different. And so again, it goes back to the only person I know that swears they are still a pantser, that they never have a plan going into a novel, is Stephen
Stephen
King.
King, yeah.
And as famous and as great as some of his work is, by his own admission, he recognizes a lot of his endings suck. And a lot of his early work was only possible because he was on heavy narcotics. And so when I meet a writer that says that they're going to try the pantser approach, it does usually happen where they come up with something good, but they only realize they could have done something better after they finish writing their story. And it takes them to finish the story before they realize they could do something better, because that's how long it took them to get something on page for their subconscious to think about.
Mm. Do you think that there's a way to just be a pure pantser and still write a powerful ending, or do you think you'd have to, on some level, have that planned out?
If it's possible, I haven't seen it done successfully yet. I'm
I
sure
don't think
it's
I have
out
either.
there, but it also goes back to a lot of people who claim that they're pantsers are lying.
Yeah,
Like,
I
I
think
don't
this is
think you can think
exaggerated.
about a story for 3 or 4 years and then start writing and then claim, oh, I never had an outline. The last 4 years was your outline.
Right. Or even yeah, or even if they did earlier versions of it and then redid it or whatever, it's just like yeah, I think yeah, it's just I mean, even in a sense, if you edit it, could you kind of classify that? That's not really outlining, but you know, you're adjusting the ending with the understanding of what's come before it. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a way you can just purely just write a story just from start to finish and just never plan it and it's just got a solid ending. I think you're like you can. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just so much of the opposite of that, and obviously, I guess evidently we both are. That it's just I guess it's difficult for me to just. It doesn't even feel right. It's like I couldn't do it. Like you know, I could, but I mean in a sense of as a full story, especially for a book and a fantasy book. That's another thing as well. Do you think genre plays into it? Do you think maybe some genres are better suited to um, putting less planning in than others. Because I mean, if you're making a fantasy story, that comes with expectations of world
Yep.
building, magic, and you know what I mean, being more epic. So to not plan it would be quite crazy.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's definitely a point there where the more plot heavy independent genres, you definitely need more of a plan. I could see you getting away with not having a plan if you're writing a comedy.
Yeah,
But at that point, it's like the comedy people are coming for your jokes. They don't necessarily care about the plot. The plot's only there to facilitate the joke. So,
yeah. There's always the thing I heard about with Agatha Christie where she would plan out her murder mysteries and she would never know who the killer was. And she would pick someone. And in a sense, by her not knowing, it meant the story was written in a way where there was no specific person in mind. So it kind of, I guess that's quite an interesting way of doing it. I guess because there's something like that where it's a mystery and it's like who done it. And every single time, if someone's coming to your stories with who done it, they're gonna constantly be looking for that person. So if you don't really know, maybe then you won't put like those subconscious tells or do things that will kind of give it away. But I don't know if, and this maybe just because I'm not much of a big fan of Agatha Christie, but I don't know how well that translated to foreshadowing those like those outcomes or
mhm.
not. And I don't even know if that's true, but I just know that that's what was claimed. You know, again, it could just be a classic case, and maybe people who love Agatha Christie will be like, "How dare you? She wouldn't like." But I don't know. Like a lot of if I'm just being honest, and I think because we're both writers, we sometimes writers want to create a whole mystique around what they do. So I don't know if it's that or if it's like, okay, yeah, you genuinely didn't plan it. I do think that's believable. It's possible, to be honest, but I don't know how. Yeah, if anyone else would do that or how frequently that works.
If you are the type of writer that wants to try to write something and not have a plan, you are more than welcome to leave us in the comments your story and let us know how well it's going for you.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, yeah, why not? Why not? Because yeah, I don't know. I really would like to attempt trying to do that, just making a story just more pantsing and just not outlining at some point. I just don't know if I could do a fantasy book like that. Just seems like it's way too much planning is required, in my opinion. But yeah, with comedy and stuff, I would say otherwise. I guess also we can still touch on just the idea of knowing when the story's done, when you feel like it's finished. Like when would you say for you? Because you've written so many more stories, so you've
Mhm.
gone through that process way more times than I have. And so, what would you say after all your experience of writing all these different books, like, and the difference between when you was first starting, maybe as opposed to now, like where you'd be way more better at knowing this is where it ends.
Mhm.
What would you say was like some of your experiences with that, with knowing when something's
Right.
finished?
So like I said before, when I make a story and outline it, the plot is usually the very last thing I get to. So by that point, I have a good enough understanding of who the main characters are for my story. So the ending is usually for me, I figure out where the character needs to start. So that's the beginning of the story. And then for me, I like to leave a little room to breathe and analyze what has happened to the character. So the very last page is going to be Z. So I would say that the climax, the big twist or change for the character is probably going to happen around the letter S or T. And so that's usually how it goes for me. I figure out where the character starts. The climax is when the big change happens to them, where they've grown or changed into the person that they need to become. And they do it by either beating the big bad, by saving the world, by doing whatever it is they need to. And then I leave a little bit room to help the character kind of decompose, figure out this is what's happened to me, this was my journey, and then that's my ending. And so it's funny where if you read all my stories, you can kind of guess when the soft ending is going to be by looking at the page count. And I've had people do that to me before where they're like, okay, I'm going to guess in this chapter is when the final boss fight happens. And again, it's a formula, but it's a formula that works for me.
Yeah, I would imagine after writing a certain number of books, that's just gonna happen unless you just specifically go out of your way to subvert that every single time. Because even when I've just looked at plans I have for other stories, I'm like, this is quite similar in certain ways to what I've already done, or not entirely, but just certain structural things or certain kinds of with the endings, I can see certain similarities and stuff. One thing I definitely think for sure is going to happen is you've got like this, like I don't know if there's an actual phrase for this, but I guess there's certain stories where you get like a lot of like plot twists or revelations that just kind of happen like one after the other, like just stacked up. I think I'm definitely one of those types of writers for sure. Like I think based on the book I'm writing now, I think I'm definitely one of those people where it's going to be like, bam, something happened, and then like right after, bam, another thing happened. It's like, whoa, I would hope that's not overwhelming, but I've found that I really enjoy sometimes when stories just hit you with like, oh my gosh, like after it's been built up to, it just feels very satisfying to get those answers and those twists and explanations and stuff. But yeah, I'd say yeah, for me, I don't know. I was also thinking more kind of like as well on top of the story, also like just knowing when to say the book is done, like it's good enough. Like I'm
Mhm.
content with this.
Okay.
Yeah, and just being like, that's it.
Mhm. And I think it depends entirely on the person, what their aim is. If
Mhm.
you're trying to get traditionally published, your work can actually be less done than your average writer who's going to go get self-published. And it's because if you are submitting it to get published by a agent or a big publishing company, they want room for them to look it over and be like, okay, we need you to change A, B, C, and D. There are some agents that are like, hey, you don't even have to write a full manuscript. Just write the first 3 or 4 chapters. Come to me with that, and then we'll try to ship it around. Uh, I wouldn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to those agents. A lot of agents claim that, but most agents who say that really are looking for complete manuscripts. But in terms of just kind of where you need to be finished, for me, because of my writing style, and because of how it's structured and kind of meta message and all that, I don't feel like mine has to be absolutely perfect. In
Yeah.
fact, I've had a couple works where I submitted to get professionally edited, and then went back and added a few errors and changed a few things just to make it more personal, to make it more real, and not feel like this is another big corporate book that I'm buying. But
Mm.
again, it's going
That's
to depend up to you, because if
mhm.
you're self-publishing and you want to get your work edited, if you have a 60,000 word novel, that's probably going to cost you an average between $2,000 to $3,000 is what most of the editors I see nowadays. And the average person can't afford that for a self-published novel that they'll be lucky to make $50 off of.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if you're like me, you write really slow, you know. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting though because it's a funny thing as well. You say that like with traditional where you can have it less ready. You know, I'm going to be honest, and this is no shade to people who self-publish because we both self-publish, but I'm just going to be completely honest. Um, I think a lot of people who are in traditional will be like, well, oh, those self-published books don't look very finished to me. You know,
Yep.
which let's it's a fair enough stereotype. But yeah, generally, like if you want it to be solid, then yeah, you would have to because it all the works pretty much on you. Even if you're going to say about getting an editor and stuff, you still have to kind of go out of your way to do that. And you know, even then, you're going to want to make sure that it's someone who's doing it properly and things of that nature. So yeah, there's a lot of those things to consider. Um, but for me, I would just say it's kind of difficult because I can only base on the one book. So just based off of that, I would just say that it took me a long time before I realized it was done. Because I spent so many years working on. So when I took 9 months to outline the very first version of the story. I wrote that first version. I used to remember the exact amount of time it took me. Um, I can't remember now. I think it was a similar amount of time though to how long it took me to outline. It didn't take me a year to write the first version, but it took just a bit under that. And when I was done with that first version, I was like, okay, it's finished. And I still have the document where it's like, that's it. And it was like 150K words or something. It was actually longer than it was longer than it was now. Um, and it was, like I say, it was just trash compared to what I turned it into. But that it took me so much time. I had to go through the process of being like, this isn't working. I don't like this character. Actually, the character arcs aren't really working. They're not really coming to fruition the way I want. I don't feel like this is flowing properly. This plot twist is kind of shocking, but it doesn't really flow with anything that preceded it. Like there's just so much different elements like that. And so really one thing I for my process specifically was I just had to because I was so new to all of this. And as I mentioned before, I used to be a reluctant reader. I had to just go and read more books. That was actually something I personally did. Went and read more books, listened to a lot more writing advice, so I could help myself kind of understand really where it would be right to finish because I didn't really know. And so I kind of like I was like reading books, but I started, and this is something I did a lot. Whenever I found there was something I was stuck with, and I'm doing it even right now, um, if I find that there's something that I'm struggling with, I will go and look at other works, and at the forefront of my brain will be that specific thing that I'm thinking of. So like I remember when I very first started writing, I always used to feel like my like writing settings was I didn't feel like it was very good. I had people who told me otherwise, but I personally just didn't feel like it was very good. And I thought like if I and this again came from me being a reluctant reader, I didn't understand how if I wanted to describe a room, just a simple bedroom, in text, I wasn't comfortable with doing that. I didn't really know how I'm going to get across the idea that this is a certain architecture or certain. Even still now, sometimes I feel a bit odd about that. And I'm not going to lie to you, I still get surprised when people tell me, yeah, it's so vivid and I pictured it so clearly in my mind. I still get surprised by that because I still have an insecurity around not being able to write locations very well. I just don't I've always felt like it's one of my weaknesses. I don't know. People might disagree with me with that, but that's just what I personally always felt. And because of that, when I would read books, I would specifically pay attention to how people describe things. I would even like reread lines, or if I was listening to an audiobook, I would rewind it and be like, how did they write that? How did they do that? Slow it down. Like I would study it so in depth. Just like I really want to understand how they did this so I can try and do it properly. And I did that very thing. I'm still doing it now, like with trying to understand the middle section and all that. So when I was trying to understand how to finish something, or how I felt like this is enough work is done, I've done enough and I can walk away from it, I would really pay attention to obviously completed debuts. And I was specifically focused on debut novels because I wanted to see someone who was comparatively relatively at a similar stage to me. So this is their, it may not even be the first book they wrote, but a lot of the people I was looking at, it was a lot of times the first book. Now it might have gone through a lot with their publisher or whatever, so it wasn't exactly the same as me. But at the time, I was still debating whether I was going to self-publish or traditionally publish. So as far as I'm concerned, I could end up just like them anyway. So yeah, but I did that a lot. That was something I just found for me. I don't know if it's necessary for everyone to do, but I just found that for me, that really helped me to understand the answer to this question, because when I was trying to figure out by myself, yeah, I had a certain instinct, an idea, and when I outlined, I felt like this is probably where the story should end. But when it came to like into story terms, I was kind of okay with that. I kind of understood how to structure the story after seeing so much media. You kind of have some of a subconscious understanding of story structure anyway. This is why like things like three act structure, I never really studied in depth, and yet a lot of times when you make something, it's going to fall into that regardless. It's just part of, I think, our storytelling subconscious at this point. But when it came to like on a more technical and on a craft level of, is this good enough? Are these characters fleshed out enough? Does this plot actually work? Should I expand on this? Like things like that, I didn't know, and so I would have to refer to other works to get a better understanding of whether or not I thought my work was ready for the world.
And so, just to kind of add my concluding thoughts, let's just kind of wrap this whole topic up. My two things are: number one, this is definitely a skill that every writer learns with experience. I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that you can take into writing that you don't have to have done before to do well. I think knowing if a story is ready and good and complete is something that you just have to learn through
Yeah.
experience. Because I can tell you for all my early books, yeah, I was doing major revisions for each one after I had finished writing it. Now I've written so many that I can figure out while I'm writing, this is where I need to revise my story while I'm going along. The only other point I would make is that if you are a person who is either about ready to self publish or is very interested in getting picked up by agents or finding that you're having trouble getting picked up, I would consider going out to beta readers. There
Yeah.
are services online, so you can get anonymous beta readers. You can get paid beta readers if you want a more professional opinion, or even just giving it to your friends and family that you managed to convince to read your work. Having another pair of eyes that are not your own is very helpful, especially if you are a beginner writer.
Yeah, I completely agree. Is there any particular things you would say to look at for that, or just something people should just Google?
I would say Google. Go out on your
Okay.
own. Go adventuring in this case.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. No outline, no plan for this, no architecting, just go. Okay, yeah. No, I was just wondering because
Yep.
I thought that would be interesting for people to go and look into. But yeah, I guess that's it. Since we're trying to do the shorter episode, that's it for this topic. And basically, hopefully you guys got something from it. It's one of those things where with topics like this, we're trying to pick topics that we think we can say a decent amount for 30, 40 minutes, but stuff that maybe it wouldn't take us as much or take as much time to talk about. It's just a structure we're trying out, so we're gonna see how it goes over the next few weeks and see how we make it work. But I think it should be okay. Should be okay. Probably gonna do another episode after this now, so we're gonna be wearing the same clothes. So again, as I said earlier, do not judge us. Okay.
And with these shorter episodes, you no longer have an excuse to nap through the middle of it. Because I have had a friend admit to me that already, that we were
Ah,
great for helping him fall asleep.
well, that's great. I mean, hey, look, I've fallen asleep for a lot of things, a lot of podcasts and audiobooks, so it is what it is. Hey, and another thing as well, guys, because I know people forget this, but I use this a lot. Just remember, YouTube does have an option where you can speed up the video. Okay, it's probably not helpful to tell you this at the end right now, but just for future reference, because and I'm only saying that because like I use it all the time when I listen to like YouTubers or podcasters or live streams that I've I'm where I'm used to the person. If I'm not used to them, I won't do it. But if I'm used to them, I'm like, yeah, I already know how this will go. Let me just put this on 1.5, or I'm crazy. I'll go to 1.75 or 2 times, and even audiobooks, I'll put that on 2.4. Like, yeah, 1.5 is too slow. But anyway, that's pretty much everything from us for this episode. Please be sure to leave any comments, any thoughts below. Of course, like the video if you enjoyed it. I know it's cliche YouTube stuff, but it matters. Okay. And that is pretty much all from us. We will see you in the next episode. And yeah, that's it.
Ciao.
See ya.